Part 67. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 661. After Lin Yu saw Fire Kylin like this, he only felt a little strange, but as for what was strange, he couldn't explain it for a while. At this time, Lin Yu gently rubbed his chin. After pondering for a long time, he suddenly realized that this fire unicorn seemed to be too young. Compared with the age of humans, it was probably less than 1 year old. But now, he has sent the Eternal Thunder Dragon to follow the little guy. If the Eternal Thunder Dragon had not been sent out, maybe he could still have a good fight with this big guy now. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly realized that he seemed to have no one available. At this moment, in his mind, a very cute little guy made a squeaking sound, which seemed to remind Lin Yu of his existence. When Lin Yu noticed this little guy, a bit of excitement suddenly flashed in his eyes. Yes, there is also the red sand beast. This little guy should be able to stand alone now. After Lin Yu thought of this, the excitement on his face began to become more and more obvious. At this time, he quickly summoned the red sand beast without saying a word. After the scarletly and yellow sand beast was summoned, the pressure of the fire Kylin and the redly and yellow sand beast, two alien beasts from the realm of gods, was revealed at the same time. Even that guy felt the pressure from these two little guys. After that, they couldn't help but subconsciously take a few steps back and looked at Lin Yu with a look of horror. Lin Yu slowly took a step forward, and then stared at the guy in front of him with a smile on his face. At this time, he seemed to be the master overlooking all things. Dark beast, right? Today I have two alien beasts from the realm of gods. I want to see how powerful your dark beast is, and whether you can really defeat these two alien beasts of mine. Put that pressure on. Lin Yu's smile was so weird that even calling that guy made him shudder. The guy's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Boy, don't be so proud yet. The power of my strange beasts is far beyond what you, a boy, can imagine. You can laugh now, but you will still cry later. After the man finished speaking, he clasped his hands together, and then formed an extremely mysterious curse seal, followed by hundreds of millions of curse seals, and suddenly, a red-black light emitted. The light directly enveloped the dark beast. After the dark beast was wrapped, it let out a shrill scream, and then a ray of light scattered out. After that ray of light, you saw that the dark beast split into another dark beast again in an instant. At this time, the guy's breath was also abnormally weak. At this time, he was breathing heavily, but the smile on his face was still very obvious. Boy, what else do you have to say now? At this time, he was quite weak, and you could feel it from the tone of his voice. Lin Yu was condescending, staring at the man with his eyes. After a moment, he suddenly smiled like this. The smile was a bit sarcastic. Really? He forcibly used his own Shen Yuan as a chain to form a person who was so destructive to him. The cursed seal of the soul, is there anything worth showing off? Lin Yu just said this coldly, condescendingly, looking down on the world and looking down upon the heroes. At this time, Lin Yu seemed to be a lofty master, with a kind of desolation in his eyes. But at this time, the man never expected that Lin Yu could see through him with just one glance. He stared at Lin Yu, and then he clenched his fists and said almost like gritting his teeth, "You who are they? Where did you learn this?" The man's voice was a little hoarse, and he took a few steps back, his face a little pale. The man stepped back, and Lin Yu moved forward. Lin Yu stared at the man condescendingly, and then shook his head slightly. You don't have to worry about my identity for the time being. How I know it doesn't need to be your concern. You just need to know that you will die, and that's fine. Lin Yu just said in a cold voice. At this moment, the man also took a few steps back. At the end, the face under the mask suddenly became ferocious, and he was almost speaking like gritted teeth. Boy, if you want me to die, you are not worthy, So who are you? Today I will kill you, and I will let you know what the price is. After the man finished speaking, he suddenly flew towards Lin Yu. Then others saw that the man was extremely fast. In just one breath, he had already arrived at Lin Yu's side. Forward. But at this time, Lin Yu only shook his head slightly. Oh, why bother? Are you asking for trouble like this? Why are you doing this? After Lin Yu finished speaking, he waved his hand suddenly, and then spit out a wind of war from the mouth of the red sand beast. The wind of war had no effect on the dark energy emitted by the dark beast. Effect. However, the Kylin holy fire of the fire Kylin has a natural restraining effect on the dark aura of the dark beast, so the Kylin holy fire first consumed the dark aura, and then the war gale arrived as promised. That turbid aura instantly swept the universe, and in just a moment, just in a breath, the war gale completely wrapped up the guy. And at this moment, two figures shuttled freely in the jungle, and the two beautiful figures were like dancing butterflies in the jungle. Yalangshuang, did you feel the breath of that little guy in front? Yalangshuang heard Suyuyan say this, just turned his head and looked at her, and then nodded heavily. Yes, I did feel the breath of that little guy, but... Yalangshuang paused here, his expression condensed. After hearing what Yalangshuang said, Suyuyan just said in a deep voice, just what? Just in addition to the duck or the breath, there is also a very strange power. As for that power, I can't quite detect it, but I always feel it's a bit weird. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 662. After Suyuyan heard Yalangshuang say this, she just smiled slightly, and then glanced at Yalangshuang casually, with quite amusement in her eyes. Are you in love, little girl? Have you remembered something? Suyuyan stared at Yalangshuang with a smile on her face. 3 black lines appeared on Yalangshuang's forehead, and she was even more speechless. I advise you not to talk nonsense here, otherwise, don't blame me for being rude. Yalangshuang's voice was a bit cold, and this bit of coldness also scared off Suyuyan, who just waved her hand casually. TCH, I'm just joking with you. Why do you look like this? At this time, Yalangshuang rolled her eyes at Suyuyan. After a while, the two people arrived at the place where Lin Yu and the guy were fighting. When they arrived, the violent wind of war immediately hit the two of them. After seeing this scene, Suyuyan's face turned ugly instantly, and then she pulled Yalangshuang up, and the two of them faced back at the same time. After retreating for a long time, they managed to stabilize their bodies. At this time, Suyuyan's face darkened, and then she couldn't help but cursed bastard secretly. Damn it! At this time, Suyuyan and Yalangshuang didn't say a word, but hurriedly retreated towards the back. The two of them retreated very quickly. The scene changed in an instant, and they had already exited. Nearly tens of meters. At this time, Suyuyan and Yalangshuang stood firm at the same time, and then took a deep breath to calm down their moods a little. At this moment, Suyuyan seemed to have remembered something. His face was slightly raised, his expression suddenly condensed, and his eyes seemed to be quite complicated. This is the wind of war. Suyuyan just said in a deep voice, and the excitement between her eyebrows was simply beyond words. Yalangshuang felt a little strange when she heard Suyuyan say this. Her eyes looking at Suyuyan were a bit complicated, and then she took a deep breath. What happened to Zhang Gangfeng? Is there any problem? Yalangshuang said softly and unhurriedly, then glanced at Suyuyan, and then took a deep breath, and her brows seemed to be knitted together. Similar. At this time, Amelia Su was also so deep. She took a breath and then calmed down her mood slightly. Don't forget that there seems to be a little guy in our academy who can fight the Gangfeng, and that guy almost hurt me a few days ago. Amelia Su just said softly. After Suyuyan finished speaking, Ye Langshuang's expression was suddenly startled, and then she said in a deep voice. I remember, you said it was that guy. Ye Langshuang's eyes were fixed on Suyuyan's body, her brows seemed to be knitted together, and her expression was full of disbelief. It's unlikely. Maybe it's a coincidence. Don't forget that the little guy shouldn't be so strong. After all, it's only been a few days. What do you think? Ye Langshuang's eyes were fixed on Suyuyan, and at this time, Suyuyan also had a wry smile on her lips, and then she shook her head helplessly. I always think that little guy is a little strange, and I feel like this time it might actually be him. Suyuyan just said so softly, with a somewhat complicated meaning in her eyes, and then she took a deep breath. At this time, Ye Langshuang just pondered for a moment after hearing what Suyuyan said. Maybe what you said is true, but maybe it's not true. I'll have to take a closer look at that little guy later. Ye Langshuang just said so softly, and then she half closed her eyes. After Suyuyan heard what Ye Langshuang said, she just pondered for a moment, and then gently touched her chin. But if he deliberately hid it from us in the first place, then I'm afraid that if we really expose this little guy, if he gets angry from shame, with the strength of the two of us, then... Suyuyan just said so softly, and then took a deep breath. Ye Langshuang just smiled like this, and then turned her head, staring directly at Suyuyan, with a bit of playfulness in her eyes, and the smile at the corner of her mouth became even more obvious. What? Is it possible that you are scared now? Ye Langshuang spoke unhurriedly, with a hint of light shining in her eyes, and the smile at the corner of her mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, after Suyuyan heard what Ye Langshuang said, she glared at Ye Langshuang angrily, and then took a step forward. Who is scared? Stop talking nonsense here, how could I be scared of that little guy? Suyuyan just said in a deep voice, but at this time, he did feel a little scared in his heart. After all, some things were indeed a bit elusive. When Suyuyan thought of this, her eyes were full of complex meanings, and then she frowned slightly. Ye Langshuang and Suyuyan rushed to the battlefield. From a distance, they saw the red sand beast and the fire Kirin standing on Lin Yu's shoulders at the same time. At this time, after they saw the two beasts at the same time, their eyes were instantly filled with disbelief, and their pupils suddenly enlarged. How is it possible? How could this be? The voices of Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang even trembled a little. At this time, the man seemed to have discovered their existence. The man just turned his head and glanced at them coldly. There was a bit of gloom in his eyes, and the murderous aura on his body was even more awe-inspiring. A mere ant dared to spy again, damn it! After the man finished speaking, he twisted his mind, and then a violent breath instantly emanated from the man's body, attacking them wildly. Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang both screamed. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 663. Then the two of them moved towards each other one after another, and after taking a few steps back, they barely managed to stabilize their bodies. But what they never expected was that the dark turbidity did not fall on the two of them. Instead, a man stood in front of them. The man's profile is quite handsome. At this time, the man turned his head, glanced at the two of them, and then smiled slightly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth was even more obvious. And at this moment, a wave of blood energy surged, and the violent power instantly filled the air. After everyone felt the diffuse blood energy, they instantly felt a sense of fear coming from their bones. Interesting, it's really interesting. I didn't expect you to help these two ants, which really surprised me. At this time, the man was condescending, turned his head, and nailed Lin Yu, exuding a violent blood energy. The violent blood energy filled the air, causing everyone's souls to tremble a little. Just between a breath and a breath, just in this brief moment, the dark power moved towards Lin Yu at the same time, wrapping it up from all directions, making Lin Yu even feel a little intimidated. Feeling. Lin Yu took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood slightly. He turned his head and glanced at the two girls. "You two, be careful and don't let this guy plot against you. Otherwise, I'm afraid even if the great Luo Immortal comes, he won't be able to save you two," Lin Yu just said softly. At this time, Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang were still shocked by Lin Yu's strength. At this time, their faces instantly changed like this, as if they were frozen. Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang nodded slightly. We got it." Lin Yu did not pay attention to the two of them anymore, but suddenly jumped forward, and then stepped forward like this. The momentum on his body was undoubtedly revealed, and a monstrous aura filled the air, and then that a violent momentum made everyone's souls start to tremble. Of course, at this time, Lin Yu's blood was even more permeating his body. The purity of the blood even made the dark beast feel it, and he couldn't help but feel intimidated. The dark beast subconsciously took a few steps back with a frightened look on its face, and it felt a kind of fear in its soul. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. He just coughed lightly, and the fierce pressure on his body instantly gathered in all directions of the man. The dark beast had no intention of fighting at this moment, and almost instantly abandoned the man and ran away. Even after Lin Yu saw this scene, he was shocked and dumbfounded. Lin Yu groped his chin, and then pondered for a moment. "It's interesting. It's really interesting. This is the first time I've seen it. A strange beast can actually lose its owner," Lin Yu said calmly and coldly. The man's face instantly turned ugly, his eyes widened with anger, his eyes fixed on Lin Yu, he clenched his fists, and almost gritted his teeth as he spoke. "Boy, what are you so crazy about? Today I'm in trouble. I'll kill you or behead you, it's up to you." At this time, the man's voice even trembled slightly, a layer of dense cold sweat broke out on his forehead, and his face looked a little ugly. At this time, after seeing the man like this, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. He gently touched his chin, and then stared at the man with a smile on his face. "If you want to kill or behead me, do you want to do whatever you want? This is what you said." Lin Yu slowly walked towards the man. At this time, he looked down on the world and looked down upon the others. Lin Yu looked condescending, and his eyes looked a little gloomier when he looked at the man. When the man saw Lin Yu like this, he couldn't help but subconsciously move towards him, took a few steps back, and then swallowed in the same way. "You, what do you mean?" I. The man's words were even a little incoherent, his eyes were erratic, his face gradually turned pale, and he looked a bit ridiculous. After waiting for a while, Lin Yu just waved his hand, and then a ball of flames burned the man to ashes. At this time, Lin Yu just snorted coldly, and then shook his head slightly. "That's all, I thought I could do anything," Lin Yu said in a deep voice, and the murderous aura in his body gradually spread. At this time, Ye Lengshuang and Su Yuyan, who were far away, couldn't help but feel a little emotional after seeing Lin Yu's power from a distance. Lin Yu slowly walked towards the two of them, looking at them with a somewhat complicated look. "Can you two pretend that you haven't seen what happened today?" Lin Yu's voice was a little cold, just like the biting cold wind in the cold winter, without any warmth. At this time, Su Yuyan and Ye Lengshuang, after hearing what Lin Yu said, couldn't help but subconsciously move towards and take a few steps back, and then nodded their heads like chickens pecking at rice. Listen clearly," Lin Yu just nodded slightly, and then waved away. Lin Yu turned around and walked away for a long time, but neither of them followed him. At this time, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He turned his head angrily towards the two of them, just glanced coldly, and then he said in a deep voice, "Why are you two just walking there and standing there in a daze?" After Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang heard what Lin Yu said, they trotted towards Lin Yu. At this time, Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang were just looking at Lin Yu with smiles on their faces. Interesting. It's really interesting. I'm really curious. Why do you pretend to be like that if you have such strong strength? Suyuyan said softly, with a bit of complexity in her eyes, staring straight at Lin Yu. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 664. The two of them looked at Lin Yu with a smile on their faces, which made Lin Yu even a little embarrassed. At this time, Lin Yu just coughed lightly, and then glanced at them unhappily. Ahem, you don't need to know the reason for this for now. Lin Yu just said in a deep voice, and his eyes were quite complicated. After Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang heard what Lin Yu said, they rolled their eyes at Lin Yu unhappily. If you don't want to say it, then forget it. If you don't want to say it, we don't want to listen to it. After Lin Yu heard what the two girls said, there were 3 black lines on his forehead in an instant, and gradually began to become clear. He was speechless in his heart. He just shook his head helplessly, but didn't say anything more. After a while, Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang seemed to remember something, and just turned their heads and looked at Lin Yu. I have something to ask you. Suyuyan looked very serious. After hearing what Suyuyan said, Lin Yu was also confused. What is it? Ask. It should be you who fought with the powerful man in black in the sky above the battle city. Suyuyan stared at Lin Yu with a complicated look in her eyes. After hearing what Suyuyan said, Lin Yu just pondered for a moment and suddenly smiled. How can you be sure that the person must be me? Lin Yu said softly and slowly, with a smile on his face. The little thing with flames on your body just now appeared in the eyes of the whole city, so of course I can know it, but these 2 beasts in the realm of gods, even I envy your luck a little bit. Suyuyan said with a smile. After hearing what Suyuyan said, Lin Yu just pondered for a moment, then waved his hand and smiled. I have another beast from the realm of the gods that may surprise you even more, but that little guy was sent out by me. Lin Yu turned his head to Suyuyan, just glanced at her, and then said softly. After Suyuyan heard what Lin Yu said, a little surprise flashed in her eyes, and her eyes were staring at Lin Yu. What? You still have it? At this time, even Ye Langshuang, who was relatively calm and composed, couldn't help but look at Lin Yu with wide eyes after hearing what Lin Yu said. It was as if he had seen a ghost, and his eyes were full of disbelief when he looked at Lin Yu. At this time, when Lin Yu saw the two of them like this, he just felt a little funny, and then he spread his hands lightly. Yes, I have it. Lin Yu just said it softly and slowly. Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang looked at each other, looking at Lin Yu as if they were looking at a monster, full of disbelief and inconceivability. After a while, Lin Yu couldn't help but waved and smiled. Ha ha ha, don't make such a fuss, these are just normal. At this time, Lin Yu stared at the two of them with a smile on his face, and the 3-point smile at the corner of his mouth was even more obvious. After Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang heard Lin Yu say this, their faces trembled suddenly, and then their eyes stared straight at Lin Yu, and looked up and down at Lin Yu. Monster, it's just a complete monster. After a long while, the two said so. At this time, after hearing what the two of them said, Lin Yu couldn't help but smile, and there was a bit of playfulness in his eyes. At this moment, Lin Yu seemed to have noticed the strange look in the eyes of the two people, so he just coughed lightly, and then waved his hand casually. Ahem, I'm just like this, it's not a great skill, but I'm just lucky, it's just luck. Lin Yu just said this softly, and the 3-point smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious, and there was a bit of playfulness in his eyes. At this moment, Ye Langshuang just glanced at Lin Yu, and his face couldn't help but slightly raised. I'm really curious now. At this time, Lin Yu heard Ye Langshuang say this, and then he suddenly laughed, and he just coughed lightly. Ahem, what are you curious about? Ye Langshuang looked up and down at Lin Yu, and then came to Lin Yu's side and whispered softly in Lin Yu's ear, I'm curious. When Lin Yu heard what Ye Langshuang said, he turned his head and glanced at Ye Langshuang, his eyes were full of surprise, and his face seemed to be twisted together. Where did you hear this? Lin Yu said this almost with gritted teeth, and his eyes were fixed on Ye Langshuang. When Ye Langshuang heard what Lin Yu said, he also playfully stuck out his tongue at Lin Yu. Then guess it? The smile on Ye Langshuang's lips was obvious, and there was a bit of playfulness in his eyes. At this time, Lin Yu took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood a little. He just coughed lightly, ahem, the joke you said is not funny at all. I don't like your joke very much. Lin Yu said softly, and then glanced at Ye Langshuang, with a bit of gloom in his eyes. Ye Langshuang just waved his hand casually. Really? I think my joke is not bad. The two looked at each other, and the air between them seemed to freeze in an instant. And at this moment, Su Yuyan naturally understood the contradiction between the two people. So at this time, Su Yuyan just shook her head and smiled, and then walked towards the two of them. I say, you two, why are you doing this now? Wouldn't it be better if you both took a step back? Su Yuyan said slowly and softly, and then she slowly walked towards the two of them, with a smile on her face, and her every move was more charming. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 665. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Su Yuyan said, he suddenly smiled. He just waved his hand casually, and his eyes were a little colder. What if I say I feel bad? Lin Yu turned his head, his eyes looking up and down on Su Yuyan's body, and a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this moment, Su Yuyan was stunned for a moment, and then turned her head and rolled her eyes at Lin Yu. Of course it's up to you to decide whether it's good or not. It has nothing to do with me anyway. Su Yuyan slowly raised her head, staring straight at Lin Yu. There was a bit of teasing in her eyes, but there was quite a bit of irresistibility in her look. At this time, Lin Yu and Su Yuyan were standing together, and neither of them said that they would take a step back first and not give in an inch. After waiting for a while, Ye Langshuang felt comfortable watching the show from the sidelines. Lin Yu also glanced at Su Yuyan and Ye Langshuang at the same time, with a bit of complexity in his eyes. You two are just playing with fire. Lin Yu said in a deep voice, his eyes were quite gloomy, and his face was slightly ugly. After Su Yuyan and Ye Langshuang heard what Lin Yu said, they looked at each other like this, and then they also covered their faces and smiled. Really? Maybe so, maybe not. But the two of us know one thing. Lin Yu chuckled. Oh, what do you two know? You must find a way to save Dugu Qinghong. Are we right or wrong? Ye Langshuang stared at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, and there seemed to be some complexity in her eyes. Lin Yu pondered for a moment, then gently touched his chin, and nodded slightly after a while. Yes, I still want to save this little girl Dugu Qinghong, so what? What do you want to say? Lin Yu turned around and glanced at the two of them, his expression a little frozen and his expression a little serious. Su Yuyan and Ye Langshuang couldn't help but smile slightly after hearing what Lin Yu said. Keek, since the two of us guessed well, then this is the best. The two of us can help you find a way to save Dugu Qinghong. In return, you can complete the work just done by Ye Langshuang, and how about that thing you mentioned? Dugu Qinghong's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu, and there was quite a bit of hope in his eyes. At this time, Lin Yu took a deep breath and calmed down his mood slightly. He glanced back and forth at them, thinking about what their purpose was. But Lin Yu thought about it for a long time, but couldn't figure out what the purpose of the two of them was. At this time, Lin Yu took a deep breath, and then nodded slightly. Okay, I promise you this. At this time, Lin Yu was speaking softly, with a bit of amusement in his eyes. After Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang heard what Lin Yu said, their expressions instantly became excited, and then they nodded heavily. Okay, if that's the case, then we've made it a deal. Lin Yu nodded gently, it's a deal. The two of them looked quite excited. After Lin Yu saw the expressions of the two of them, he just nodded. The three-pointed smile at the corner of his mouth gradually became clearer. There was quite a bit of excitement between his eyebrows. At this time, Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang seemed to have remembered something and turned to glance at Lin Yu. By the way, there's something I want to ask you. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Ye Langshuang said, his expression could not help but condense slightly, and then he looked at Ye Langshuang with such vigilance, and then said softly. What's the matter? Lin Yu's voice was a little hoarse, and there was a bit of confusion in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, Ye Langshuang's meaningful smile gradually became clearer, and her eyes were staring directly at Lin Yu, with a hint of amusement in her eyes. A very important thing. After seeing Ye Langshuang like this, Lin Yu always felt that Ye Langshuang didn't have any good intentions, so he was so angry that he rolled his eyes at Ye Langshuang, and then said in a deep voice. He said, if you have anything to say, please tell me quickly. If I can answer you, I will naturally answer you. 3 black lines appeared on Ye Langshuang's forehead, and she felt speechless in her heart. Actually, it's not really a big deal, but I just want to ask where you got all these god-level beasts. Are you from Zhongzhou? Or from the Western Holy See? Ye Langshuang said in a deep voice, with a bit of solemnity in the corners of her eyes and brows, and her eyes were staring at Lin Yu so hard, with a bit of complicated meaning flashing in her eyes. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Ye Langshuang said, he couldn't help but laugh out loud, and then said angrily, I don't belong to any force, I only belong to myself. Lin Yu just spoke softly and unhurriedly, and then glanced at Ye Langshuang and Suyuyan with a smile on his face, and there was quite a bit of amusement in the corners of his eyes and brows. After Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang heard what Lin Yu said, there were 3 black lines on their foreheads, which gradually became clearer, and they were speechless for a while. Do you think the two of us will believe what you say? Suyuyan just said in a deep voice. However, things have reached the point where they are now. Even if Lin Yu doesn't answer something now, he has already answered it. So at this time, the two of them stopped asking any more questions. After Lin Yu finished talking to the two people, he immediately rushed towards Tugu's mansion. Suyuyan and Ye Langshuang returned to the office. When the two of them returned to the office, their expressions could no longer be tense. At this time, the two of them looked at each other like this, and then they did the same thing. Take a deep breath. Strange, I don't know if you noticed it, but something seems wrong. Ye Langshuang just said so softly, with some complicated meanings flashing in her eyes, and finally she couldn't help but frown slightly. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 666. At this time, Suyuyan certainly understood what Ye Langshuang meant, so at this time, Suyuyan just half closed her eyes and gently rubbed her chin. But we can't afford to offend people like this. Nowadays, even if they don't say anything or are unwilling to say anything, we can't force them to say, there's nothing we can do, there's nothing we can do. At this time, Suyuyan said helplessly, the bitter smile at the corner of her mouth was even more obvious, and there was a hint of helplessness in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. After Ye Langshuang heard what Suyuyan said, it was as if she suddenly remembered something. The three-quarter smile at the corner of her mouth suddenly became clear, and a trace of amusement flashed in her eyes. I suddenly remembered something. At this time, Amelia Su said softly. When Ye Lengshuang heard what Suyuyan said, she rolled her eyes at Suyuyan angrily, and then said in a deep voice, if you think of something, just say it quickly, don't hide it here. Tucked in, what's the point? Suyuyan just smiled, and then whispered softly, I don't know if you have ever thought about it. The group of people from the ancient East seem to have always been very mysterious, and to them, it seems that it's always been mysterious. Amelia Su just spoke softly and unhurriedly. When Ye Lengshuang heard Suyuyan say this, she couldn't help but half closed her eyes, then took a deep breath, and then calmed down her mood slightly. What you said is indeed true. It may look like what you said, but no matter what, the top priority right now is to stabilize that guy, and you must not make enemies with him. Lin Yu, who had just returned to the Dugu mansion, suddenly sneezed. Lin Yu rubbed her nose and looked slightly ugly. At this time, she also took a deep breath. Then he calmed down his mood a little bit. Are those little ladies talking bad about me again? Lin Yu half closed his eyes, and then spoke in a deep voice. After Lin Yu just stepped into the mansion, several people ran towards Lin Yu. Those people surrounded Lin Yu, and then they talked to Lin Yu in various directions. Of course, Lin Yu understood what they wanted to express. He just waved his hand gently, and then walked towards Dugu King Hong's boudoir. At this time, in Dugu King Hong's boudoir, an old man was sitting in front of the bed. There was a somewhat complicated meaning in the old man's eyes, and then he let out a long sigh. Oh, Qing Hong, why do you say that you are so young, but why do you suffer this unreasonable disaster in vain? Elder Dugu's face looked a little haggard. What was originally just a few spots of gray on his forehead turned into a full head of white hair at this moment. At this time, Lin Yu walked in slowly. Elder Dugu seemed to feel Lin Yu's presence, and then he slowly turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. Then the corner of his mouth turned into a bitter smile. Little guy, what are you doing here? Elder Dugu's voice was a little hoarse, and then he slowly turned his head, staring directly at Lin Yu, with a sense of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, when Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, a wry smile appeared on his lips, and then he said softly, I'm sorry, I'm late this time. At this time, Lin Yu's voice was trembling slightly, and his face was even more pale. The bitter smile at the corner of Elder Dugu's mouth became more and more clear, and there was a hint of helplessness between his eyebrows. Oh, you don't have to apologize to me. In fact, the one you really should apologize to is this little girl. That guy felt your breath, so he fell in love with this little girl. Qing Hong was hurt for you. Mr. Dugu's voice was a little cold, and his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Then he turned his head, eyes wide with anger. At this time, Lin Yu's face was slightly pale, and his complexion was even more ugly. At this time, he had a bitter smile on the corner of his mouth, but he just lowered his head in shame and said nothing, because at this time, I don't know what to say anymore. Elder Dugu seemed to have seen through everything. He just waved his hand and said, originally I did have selfish motives, but now I have seen through everything. I am afraid that the Dugu family cannot tolerate you now, so please just find another job. After Elder Dugu said this, he couldn't help but sigh for a long time, and the bitter smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more obvious. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, his face turned slightly pale, and then he turned his head and glanced at Elder Dugu. Maybe I can find a way to save Qing Hong. At this time, after Elder Dugu heard what Lin Yu said, he couldn't help but turn his head and stared straight at Lin Yu. His face was filled with a kind of disbelief, and his brows furrowed slightly. Wrinkle. Are you telling the truth? Elder Dugu's voice even trembled slightly. His eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, with a somewhat complicated meaning in his eyes. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, he nodded solemnly, and then glanced at Elder Dugu. That's right, What I said is true. If you let me see Hong clearly, I might really be able to save Qing Hong. Lin Yu said decisively like this. Elder Dugu was originally heartbroken, so he barely managed to save Dugu King Hong's life, but now that Dugu Qing Hong is in such a state, it seems that there is no cure or cure. But now that Lin Yu appeared and called Elder Dugu again, the already gloomy days added a bit of brilliance. At this time, Elder Dugu just coughed lightly, and then he sighed, well, now that the matter is over, Sima should be a living horse doctor. Elder Dugu stood up slowly, and then walked aside to make way for Lin Yu. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 667. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he was naturally very excited. At this time, he quickly sat next to Du Buletin Qing Hong, and then looked at Dugu Qing Hong like this. One glance, until he looked at it for a while. Lin Yu's face couldn't help but twitch slightly, and the meaningful smile at the corner of his mouth became more and more clear. There is a way, I have a way. At this time, Lin Yu's voice even trembled slightly. Because Lin Yu had just redeemed the medical god's record. Although Dugu King Hong's divine veins were weak now, and there might not be much that could be done under normal circumstances, there happened to be a record in the medical god's record, so Lin Yu naturally I was also overjoyed. When Elder Dugu heard what Lin Yu said, his face couldn't help but suddenly become so happy. What are you talking about? Do you really have a way to save Qing Hong? Elder Dugu said softly, with a complicated expression on his face. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, his expression couldn't help but turn slightly, and then a look of determination flashed in his eyes, and then he nodded heavily after pondering for a moment. Yes, I do have a way to save Qing Hong, but only if you trust me enough. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Elder Dugu, a hint of determination flashed in his eyes, and then he spoke softly. Elder Dugu was naturally ecstatic when he heard what Lin Yu said, and then nodded his head as if a chicken was pecking at rice. Believe in you, of course I believe in you. As long as you can save Qing Hong, I will not hesitate to go up to the Mountain of Swords and to the Sea of Fire. Elder Dugu turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu. There was a bit of excitement in the corners of his eyes and brows. The smile on the corner of his mouth became more and more clear. At this moment, his face was full of excitement. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he just coughed lightly, and then smiled slightly. It takes a god's herb to treat Qing Hong, but this god's herb seems to grow in the Warcraft Mountains deep in this misty forest. Now without any further delay, I will set off like this. Lin Yu said softly, and then his eyes were fixed on Elder Dugu. Elder Dugu could see from Lin Yu's eyes that they were full of sincerity. After waiting for a while, Elder Dugu seemed to hear something, and then he nodded gently. Xiao, this matter depends entirely on you, I believe you. Elder Dugu just said so softly, his eyes staring straight at Lin Yu, his eyes full of resolute and hot sincerity. When Lin Yu felt such warm sincerity in Elder Dugu, he was naturally very excited. He opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, but after thinking for a long time, he just smiled slightly. Elder Dugu, don't worry, I will definitely live up to your expectations, so just keep this matter in mind. Lin Yu said softly, and the three-pointed smile at the corner of his mouth was quite contagious. At this time, Elder Dugu turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu. Some complex colors flashed in his eyes, and finally he sighed softly. Well, anyway, this matter started because of you, so naturally it has to have a beginning and an end. As long as you can do it, from beginning to end, actually, to me, it doesn't matter. Elder Dugu just spoke softly and unhurriedly, with a somewhat complicated meaning in the corners of his eyes and brows, and then he sighed just as softly. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, he felt quite emotional in his heart, and then he smiled slightly. Don't worry about this, even if I risk my life, I will bring Qinghong back, I said so. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on Elder Dugu so directly, with a clear myopia in the corners of his eyes and brows, a sign of determination. At this time, the meaningful smile at the corner of Elder Dugu's mouth became more and more clear, and then he nodded gently. Okay, 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 just remember what you said and don't forget it when the time comes. At this time, Elder Dugu seemed to have understood something in an instant, and the smile at the corner of his mouth became even brighter. After Lin Yu heard what Elder Dugu said, he was naturally quite emotional. After pondering for a moment, he opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, but when the words reached his lips, he swallowed them back. The two people just looked at each other and smiled. At this time, the somewhat sad look on Elder Dugu's face was obviously relieved. About a quarter of an hour later, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with determination, and then he suddenly turned around and walked outside without looking back. After seeing this scene, Elder Dugu's eyebrows flashed with satisfaction, and then he looked at Lin Yu, his eyes fixed on Lin Yu's back, and the smile on his lips became more and more obvious. Great, with this little guy's help, maybe you can be saved this time, Qinghong, God treats you well. Elder Dugu just said this softly, with a bit of complex meaning in his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, he had a few tears in his eyes, and the smile on his lips became more and more obvious. At this time, Lin Yu came to the street, and then he took a deep breath, and then he calmed down a little. He looked at the bustling crowd, and there was a bit of complex meaning between his eyebrows. What should we do now? I'm afraid we really need to go find those two girls to discuss this matter first. When Lin Yu thought of this, he nodded slightly, and then rushed straight towards the direction of the Battle Academy. At this time, at the end of the alley, a man's figure suddenly appeared. The man's figure gradually revealed himself, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 668. The man followed quietly, and Lin Yu walked forward like this. At this time, Lin Yu seemed to have discovered the man's existence, but he was too lazy to argue with the man, because for him now, the top priority is to quickly go to the misty forest and go to the Warcraft Mountains. But the man seemed to think it was Lin Yu, and didn't notice that he was so proud and complacent. I thought this kid could be so capable, but now it seems like he's nothing more than that. I've been following him for so long and I didn't even notice him, but he's really a loser. The man said in a cold voice. The smile at the corner of his mouth became clearer and clearer, a sinister look appeared in the corners of his eyes and brows, and there was even more murderous aura on his body. Spread. At this time, Lin Yu certainly wouldn't have thought that the man would think so, but for him, even if he knew the man thought so, he would just laugh it off because he didn't take the man seriously at all. Just like humans don't care too much about ants. After waiting for a while, the man followed Lin Yu to the Combat Academy. At this time, the man continued and wanted to follow forward, but was stopped by a man wearing a security uniform. This gentleman, this is the important place of the academy, and all the idle people are waiting to leave as soon as possible. The security guard stared at the man with a certain determination in his eyes. After the man heard what the security guard said, his face suddenly froze. There was a kind of disbelief in the corners of his eyes and brows. The man's eyes were fixed on the security guard, and then he did the same. Take a deep breath. What? How did you find me? You shouldn't have found me. After the security guard heard what the man said, 3 black lines suddenly appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at the man angrily, as if he was looking at an idiot. I'm sorry, sir, I can't just sit back and ignore you, and your concealment method is actually not very good. The security guard's eyes were staring straight at the man, as if he was looking at an idiot. After the man heard what the security guard said, a bit of gloom flashed in his eyes, and the murderous aura in his body gradually began to show up. He slowly took a step forward, and then he said coldly to the security guard. Originally I didn't want to kill you, but now, since you want to die, if I don't help you today, it would be really unreasonable. The man's face was gloomy, as if he was about to drip water. There was a complete gloominess in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after the security guard heard what the man said, the corner of his mouth only raised a cold smile, and then he couldn't help but frown slightly. "Sir, please leave now, otherwise, we will take measures against you," the security guard said in a cold voice, with a completely cold look in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, after seeing the security guard say this, the man also had a cold smile on his lips, a trace of ridicule flashed in his eyes, and then he said in a deep voice, "There is no way, it seems that there is no other way now, you want to die, you can't blame others, it seems that I will definitely kill you today." After the man finished speaking, he turned his head and glanced coldly at the security guard. A sinister smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and the murderous aura began to spread from his body. An icy aura gradually spread, and that somewhat icy aura enveloped the security guard, making him even feel a little shuddering. At this time, the security guard felt a bit of the man's aura, and then he began to realize the terror of the man in front of him. At this time, the security guard subconsciously took a few steps back and stared at him in horror. Looking at the man in front of him, his voice even trembled slightly. I'm warning you, if you dare to mess around, if you dare to mess around." When the man heard what the security guard said, a cold smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and there was a bit of mockery in his eyes, and then he slowly took a step forward. In just an instant, he was in front of the security guard, and then without saying a word, he grabbed the security guard's neck. At this time, I saw the security guard struggling desperately, with a clear sense of panic in the corners of his eyes and brows. Let me go quickly, if you don't let me go, I will make you pay the price, I will make you pay the price." At this time, the security guard was talking through gritted teeth, his eyes fixed on the man, struggling desperately, and his body even trembled slightly. At this time, the man obviously looked disapproving. He threw the security guard out without saying a word, and then the security guard was crushed to pieces by a strong pressure. The man's mouth curled up into a three-point cold smile, and the murderous aura on his body gradually began to spread. Then he slowly walked forward, with a completely cold look in his eyes and eyebrows. "I hate people like you the most, I hate it more than anything else." The man walked forward slowly, and then disappeared in an instant. At this time, Lin Yu also came to this office. I don't know why Lin Yu suddenly had a bad premonition in his heart. Lin Yu half closed his eyes, and then gently rubbed his chin. "Strange, it's really a bit strange. I don't know why, I always feel a bad premonition in my mind. What's going on?" Lin Yu half closed his eyes, and then he pondered for a moment. He thought about it for a long time, and he didn't understand what was going on. Lin Yu's face was slightly ugly, and then he took a deep breath, and then calmed down a little. "No, we can't be like this anymore, this matter needs to be resolved as soon as possible." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 669. At this moment, Lin Yu suddenly opened his eyes, and then suddenly felt something like this in his heart, giving him a bit of a bad premonition. At this time, he pinched his fingers and calculated like this, then, his entire face suddenly became ugly. Oops, how could this be? At this moment, Ye Lengshuang and Suyuyan slowly walked out of a room, and happened to meet Lin Yu. Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang glanced at Lin Yu, and then such a smile was fixed on Lin Yu's body, and there was quite a bit of playfulness in his eyes. What's going on? Could it be that you have figured it out now and want to save? But before the two of them finished speaking, Lin Yu waved his hands casually, and then shook his head. Of course not, there is indeed some trouble, but you don't need to take care of this matter for the time being. Lin Yu's voice was a little cold, and there was a bit of gloominess in his eyes. His brows seemed to be squeezed together, and his whole person looked like a volcano about to erupt. Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang couldn't understand why Lin Yu suddenly became like this. At this time, the two of them couldn't help but look at each other, staring directly at Lin Yu, as if looking like a monster. Lin Yu took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood slightly, and then said in a cold voice, "I don't want to say anything else, so do me a favor." "How about?" Lin Yu said in a deep voice, then turned around and glanced in their direction, with a hint of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows, and a bitter smile on his lips. After Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang heard what Lin Yu said, they pondered for a moment and then nodded slightly. "Of course there is no problem with this, but the premise is that you tell me that you want the two of us to help. What are you busy with?" Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang spoke softly, with somewhat complicated eyes, and then stared directly at Lin Yu. Lin Yu took a deep breath, and then calmed down his mood slightly. "I know that the two of you have extraordinary identities. You are a double-star hidden child. You are unpredictable and deadly. You are decisive in killing and will be unforgettable in this world." Lin Yu just spoke softly and unhurriedly, and then glanced at the two of them. A few complex colors flashed in his eyes, and the smile at the corner of his mouth was even more, it's becoming more and more obvious. At this time, after Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang heard what Lin Yu said, their faces suddenly twisted, and their eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Naturally, they were very excited at this moment. "Alert! What did you say? What do you mean? Why can't we understand?" Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and then they spoke in a cold voice. The complicated meaning in the corners of their eyes and brows became more and more obvious. Lin Yu heard it at this time. After the two of them finished speaking, they just chuckled lightly, and then coughed lightly. "Ahem, you two don't understand. Do you really don't understand, or are you just pretending to be confused?" Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang looked at each other, and their hearts sank to the bottom of their hearts, because they knew that the secret they desperately wanted to keep seemed to be impossible to keep, so the two people looked at each other, and then took a deep breath. At the end, the two of them seemed to have made up their minds, and then they just pondered for a while. "Are you really going to take advantage of our identities?" Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang, the two of them were talking almost like gnashing their teeth. Their faces were a bit pale, and then their eyes were fixed on Lin Yu. Lin Yu nodded in various ways. "That's right, I think it's time for the Dark God record under your control to come out and help. If the Dark God record doesn't see the light of day again, I'm afraid," Lin Yu said softly, and then he stared at Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang with a smile on his face. After Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang heard what Lin Yu said, they just pondered for a moment, and after thinking about it for a while, they gave their answers. "No problem. Since you have said this, we too have nothing to say. The Dark God record can indeed be lent to you, but the two of us may not be able to help you with the herb you are looking for. You can find it?" At this moment, Lin Yu's brows were all squeezed together into the character Sichuan, and then he glanced towards the two of them. "What are you talking about? You can't find the God King herb? How is this possible? Don't think that I don't know. This Dark God record records the location of all the heavenly and earthly treasures in this continent, and they are kept by the successive Dark Twins. But it is not allowed to be used without authorization, but there is an opportunity to open this Dark Divine record once every 100 years. Am I right or not?" Lin Yu just spoke leisurely and leisurely. After Suyoyan and Ye Langshuang heard Lin Yu say this, they both sighed, and then shook their heads helplessly. "Oh, there is really nothing we can do against you, how do you know this?" Lin Yu's face instantly raised a very meaningful smile, and then he said leisurely. "How I know, you don't need to worry about it for now, you just need to tell me whether what I said is right or wrong." Lin Yu looked at the two of them looking at each other, and felt a little interesting, and then he said it softly. Suyoyan and Ye Langshuang looked at each other, and then nodded, but at this time Suyoyan took a step forward, and then said in a deep voice, "What you said this time is actually right or wrong?" When Lin Yu heard Suyoyan say this, he couldn't help but laugh suddenly. He just smiled and shook his head. "I don't know, what is right or wrong?" After Suyoyan heard Lin Yu say this, she instantly rolled her eyes, and then glanced at him unhappily. You, don't you know the reason for these things? Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 670. Lin Yu's face condensed, and then he said so softly. "That's all I know. Of course, I know more about the Dark God record than you two, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. I admit that." Lin Yu said softly, turned his head, and stared at Suyoyan. After Suyoyan heard what Lin Yu said, she also looked at Lin Yu casually, and then said so softly. "Since you have said this, I will tell you more. Although there are records of those extremely precious heavenly treasures in the Dark God record, they are just a few words. Once these heavenly treasures disappear at that location, the Dark God record will erase them." Although Lin Yu knew that the function of the Dark God record was a bit against the sky, he never thought that the Dark God record had been so against the sky. Lin Yu took a deep breath, and he began to force himself to calm down his heart, which had already fallen to the bottom of the valley. "Are you telling the truth?" Lin Yu's face was a little pale, and his voice was even trembling slightly at this time. After all, for him now, this God King herb was related to Tugu King Hong's life. If he couldn't get this God King herb, or if someone else got it first, it meant that Tugu King Hong would probably die, which was naturally not what Lin Yu wanted to see. Suyoyan and Ye Langshuang certainly understood the fear in Lin Yu's heart, but for the two of them, this was all they could say now. Suyoyan looked at Lin Yu, just a glance, and then sighed, "Alas, the two of us can use this only chance in 100 years to help you check it, but whether we can find it out, that's not certain." Suyoyan was indeed true. Lin Yu staggered back a few steps, then slumped down on a chair. He turned his head and looked at the two girls, as if he had made up his mind, and finally gritted his teeth. Investigate now," Lin Yu said firmly. Suyoyan and Ye Langshuang, after seeing Lin Yu like this, they also rolled their eyes at Lin Yu, and then someone else said in a deep voice. "Investigate just like you said, it's not as simple as you think." "Then, why not now?" Suyoyan also knew that this concern leads to confusion. Lin Yu was too concerned about Tugu King Hong's injury, so he was so anxious, and the two of them naturally understood this. So at this time, Suyoyan also smiled like this. "Things are not as simple as you think. Let's put it this way. Those who can help you will help you later. But you have to look at the two of us and not act on your own. What do you think?" Suyoyan's words were true. After hearing what Suyoyan said, Lin Yu just nodded heavily, and then said decisively, "No problem, only you two are willing to help me, I will naturally not let you two help for nothing, this thing is for you." Lin Yu deliberately spent a lot of money to buy 2 blood pills from the system mall. The effect of this blood pill is naturally self-evident. After Suyoyan and Ye Langshuang saw the blood pill in Lin Yu's hand, their eyes were a little straight. The two of them looked at each other, and then took a deep breath. This is the legendary bloodline pill? Is it true or not? How is it possible?" Suyoyan and Ye Langshuang's voices even trembled slightly, and their eyes were fixed on the 2 bloodline pills in Lin Yu's hand. Of course it's true. I never treat those who have helped me unfairly. This can be regarded as compensation for you too. You should know that the preciousness of this bloodline pill is extraordinary. It can improve the bloodline of strange beasts. To give the simplest example, this strange beast may only reach the state of chaos in its lifetime, but if it has a bloodline pill to improve its bloodline, then the strange beast can definitely reach the level of a god. At this time, Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang's hearts and minds couldn't help but tremble slightly. At this time, their breathing even felt a little hurried, and their eyes were full of desire. Lin Yu never thought that these 2 blood pills could make the dark twins so eager. At this time, Lin Yu also took a deep breath, and then smiled and shook his head. Forget it, I'll just give it to you. Lin Yu threw the 2 blood pills directly to them. Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang were firm. After taking the blood pill, they looked at Lin Yu as if they were looking at a monster. You just gave us this blood list. Suyuyan's voice even trembled slightly, and her eyes were full of disbelief when she looked at Lin Yu. Lin Yu just thought Suyuyan was a little interesting, and then he looked at Suyuyan and coughed lightly. Ahem, what? What's the problem? After Suyuyan heard what Lin Yu said, she couldn't help but shake her head, and then waved her hands. Of course there is no problem, but I think you are a bit wealthy, so you are really powerful. Lin Yu just smiled, and then waved his hand casually. Don't be suspicious when you employ people, and don't use people when you are suspicious. Shouldn't this be the most basic thing? Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang were naturally quite emotional after hearing what Lin Yu said, but they didn't say much. About a quarter of an hour later, Suyuyan and Ye Lengshuang seemed to suddenly remember something. They turned their heads and glanced at Lin Yu, and then they said softly. Now, wait until tomorrow's full moon night to open the Dark God record, but you must be mentally prepared in advance. After Lin Yu heard what Suyuyan said, it was as if all his strength had been drained away. He just sighed for a long time, and then spoke leisurely.